SABC, host broadcaster of the G20 South Africa 2025.
And welcome back to Rosebank. Of course, the G20 Ministers' Breakfast. That's the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Ronald Lamola. And this, as we segue into the Leaders Summit at the weekend, much has been discussed already. And I'm joined now by the Ambassador, the Sherpa for Norway here at the G20. And that's Mr. Henrik Harboe. Thanks so much for your time.
You're welcome. It's great to be here.
So let me first just establish, because Norway, not a member of the G20, but your interest, especially in how things have developed for this G20 presidency of South Africa.
Well, first of all, we are extremely grateful to be invited by South Africa as a guest country during the G20 presidency. So we are here to be as helpful as possible. We think it's great. This is the first G20 in Africa, and South Africa is doing a great job, and we are discussing a lot of issues that are very important for the African continent.
Issues that are important, and of course, speaking of some of those under discussion here this morning at the breakfast, the just energy transition is of course a big one for South Africa and for the African continent, given what we are seeing with climate change, and yet Africa being overburdened, if you will, given what our contribution is, but the adverse effects that we suffer. So what is Norway's contribution in that regard?
Well, I think that was one of the good discussions this morning. Energy transition is essential to deal with both the climate challenge and also creating jobs and getting growth and poverty reduction. And South Africa has a very important case in point, where you need more energy for your growth, but at the same time we need a cleaner energy, not to increase the climate problem. And this is one of the issues we discussed this morning, and it's a central issue on the G20 agenda for South Africa.
And as Norway, you are perfectly positioned to speak to that. Yeah. But given that and South Africans, perhaps more so than government, feel that they've been a bit hard done by when we talk about this just energy transition. Yes. What is just about it, and what does justice look like as we transition to cleaner energy sources?
Well, of course, that's a very complicated issue, and of course that has to be adopted to the circumstances in individual countries. But you have been very dependent on fossil fuels. You need to move towards renewable energy, because of course that has implications for jobs, people who have been working in the coal sector, for instance. So I think that's why there is an understanding also internationally that we need to support countries like South Africa in that transition, to make it just, to ensure that people who are laid off, earlier work related to coal, can get jobs in new sectors. And I think there is definitely a willingness to help you in that.
And looking at some of the other discussions, talking about Africa beneficiating more in terms of critical minerals, what's Norway's position on that?
Well, that's crucial, and I think as the panel we just listened to, this is critical minerals is one thing, but this is really about managing natural resources in general, so that you don't only exploit and then export immediately all your resources, but you try to get more local beneficiation. But then that's complicated, because then you have to have value chains in the country, and investors who would like to sort of explore and use those minerals locally in South Africa instead of just exporting them. And that's of course something you cannot just do that overnight, because that has to do with the sort of technology and also investors that are interested. But I think it's a very important topic, and then it's one of the prominent topics on this G20 agenda this year. Thanks to South Africa.
And just finally, with regard to again the inordinate debt burden for African countries, talks about perhaps the reform of the United Nations Security Council on the one hand, but the Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and some reform on that front. What is Norway's position there?
Well, that debt is a very important problem for African countries and for developing countries in general. The G20 has actually developed a framework for dealing with debt problems, but we definitely have to do more. I mean, you see how much many African countries are spending on servicing their debt instead of financing health and education, and this is a serious development problem, and the G20 and the world community has to do more. including the Bretton Woods institutions. And that's something that Norway is high up on our priority list.
And thanks so much, Ambassador Henrik Harboe, who is, of course, Norway Sherpa. Watching developments here, he's been engaging in the discussions, critical discussions in the lead up to the Leaders Summit this weekend. And, of course, just giving us Norway's perspective on all of this. And that's where we're going to leave it for now. And listening to all of our guests this morning, I really am looking forward to engaging more discursively in some of these topics as we proceed through the week. It's back to you, Leanne.
SABC, host broadcaster of the G20 South Africa 2025.